Most civil wars begin with one side trying to take power from another. The American Civil War was different. It began because nearly half the country decided it no longer wanted to be part of the same nation at all. For 4 long years, Americans fought Americans. Neighbors found themselves on opposite sides of the battlefield. Brothers wore different uniforms. Entire towns were emptied of young men, many of whom would never return. By the time the fighting ended, over 600,000 people had lost their lives, making it the deadliest war in American history. But the most surprising part of this story isn't how the war was fought. It's how a country that had celebrated its independence less than a century earlier came so close to destroying itself from within. The Civil War didn't begin with gunfire. It began with a question that politicians spent decades trying to avoid. Should slavery continue to expand across the United States? At first, this didn't seem like a problem that could tear a nation apart. After all, America was still young and growing rapidly. New territories were being settled almost every year, and many people believed the country had a bright future ahead. But every time a new territory asked to become a state, Congress faced the same argument. Would it allow slavery? That decision mattered because it affected the balance of power in Washington. Free states and slave states each wanted enough votes in Congress to protect their own interests. If one side gained too much influence, it could eventually force its policies on the other. For years, lawmakers managed to keep that balance alive through a series of compromises. One of the most famous came in 1820, when Missouri wanted to join the Union as a slave state. To prevent either side from gaining an advantage, Congress admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state at the same time. Then lawmakers drew an imaginary line across much of the Western Territory. Future states north of that line would generally prohibit slavery, while those to the south could choose differently. People celebrated the agreement because it seemed to solve the crisis. In reality, it solved almost nothing. It simply delayed the argument. As America continued expanding westward, the same question returned over and over again, and each time it became harder to answer. While politicians argued, the North and the South were quietly becoming two very different societies. The North was changing at incredible speed. Factories appeared in growing cities. Railroads connected places that had once been separated by days of travel. Millions of immigrants arrived looking for work, helping industries grow even faster. Manufacturing became the driving force behind the Northern economy, and many people believed the country's future depended on industry and innovation. The South looked completely different. Its wealth came from enormous plantations growing crops like cotton, tobacco, and sugar. Cotton alone became one of the world's most valuable products, supplying textile mills across Europe. But producing that cotton required an enormous labor force, and throughout the South, that labor came from millions of enslaved African Americans. Because of this, slavery wasn't just a social issue. It was deeply connected to the Southern economy. Many Southern leaders believed that if slavery disappeared, so would their prosperity. That difference shaped almost every political debate in the country. Northern politicians often supported tariffs that protected American factories from foreign competition. Southern leaders usually opposed them because they relied heavily on international trade. The North wanted more railroads and infrastructure. The South worried about giving the federal government too much power. And beneath almost every disagreement was the issue that neither side could escape: slavery. Then, in the 1850s, Congress tried a new solution. Instead of deciding whether slavery would exist in new territories, lawmakers said the settlers themselves should vote. On paper, it sounded fair. In reality, it became a disaster. Kansas was one of the first territories to test the new system. Almost immediately, thousands of pro-slavery supporters crossed into Kansas hoping to influence the vote. Anti-slavery settlers rushed in as well, determined to stop them. Before long, elections became chaotic, accusations of fraud spread everywhere, and political disagreements turned into violence. Homes were burned, businesses were destroyed, armed groups began attacking one another. Kansas became so violent that newspapers across the country started calling it Bleeding Kansas. It was supposed to be an election. Instead, it became a warning. If Americans were already willing to kill each other over slavery in one territory, What would happen if the disagreement spread across the entire country? Around the same time, one man was becoming impossible to ignore. His name was John Brown. Unlike many abolitionists who believed slavery should end through politics or public opinion, Brown believed it was so evil that violence was justified to destroy it. In 1859, he led a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, hoping to seize weapons and spark a massive slave uprising across the South. The plan failed almost immediately. Brown was captured by U.S. Marines led by Colonel Robert E. Lee, the very man who would later command the Confederate Army. Soon afterward, John Brown was executed. To many people in the North, he became a martyr. To many in the South, he proved their worst fears, that abolitionists would stop at nothing to destroy their way of life. By the end of the decade, trust between North and South had almost completely disappeared. Compromises no longer worked. Debates became shouting matches. Newspapers fueled fear on both sides. Every election felt more important than the last. Then, in 1860, Americans went to the polls to choose their next president. They had no idea that the result would change the country's history forever. The presidential election of 1860 wasn't just another election. It was a vote on two completely different futures for the United States. By this point, the country was so divided that even the major political parties had started breaking apart. Northern and Southern Democrats could no longer agree on the future of slavery, and new political movements were forming almost overnight. Standing at the center of all of it was a relatively new party that had grown faster than anyone expected, the Republican Party. Its candidate was Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln wasn't promising to abolish slavery everywhere overnight. In fact, during the campaign, he repeatedly said he had no legal authority to interfere with slavery where it already existed. His main argument was that slavery should not spread into America's western territories. To many voters in the North, that seemed like a reasonable compromise. To many people in the South, it sounded like the beginning of the end. If slavery couldn't expand, Southern leaders feared their political influence would slowly disappear. New free states would eventually outnumber slave states, giving the North permanent control of Congress and the presidency. Even if Lincoln never touched slavery directly, they believed the institution would eventually die on its own. Fear spread faster than facts. Southern newspapers warned that a Republican victory would destroy their economy. Public meetings became increasingly emotional, with politicians telling crowds that their entire way of life was under threat. For many people, the election no longer felt like a political disagreement. It felt like a choice between survival and surrender. When the votes were counted in November 1860, Abraham Lincoln became the 16th president of the United States. The result shocked the South. Lincoln had won without carrying a single Southern state. In many places, his name hadn't even appeared on the ballot. To Southern leaders, that proved something deeply unsettling. They believed the North had become powerful enough to elect presidents without needing Southern support at all. If that continued, what influence would the South have left? Within weeks, South Carolina made its decision. On December 20th, 1860, it officially announced that it was leaving the United States. Its leaders argued that the federal government had violated the rights of the states and no longer represented their interests. Therefore, they claimed, they had every right to withdraw from the Union. It was an extraordinary moment. For the first time in American history, a state had chosen to leave the country. But South Carolina didn't remain alone for long. One after another, 6 more states followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. Together, they formed a new nation called the Confederate States of America. They adopted a new constitution, created their own government, chose Jefferson Davis as their president, and began organizing an army. From their point of view, they weren't rebels. They believed they had peacefully created a separate country. The United States government saw things very differently. President James Buchanan, whose term ended before Lincoln took office, did almost nothing to stop the crisis. He believed secession was illegal, but he also doubted that the federal government had the constitutional authority to force states back into the Union. As a result, the situation only became more dangerous. While politicians argued, ordinary Americans faced heartbreaking decisions. Entire families were divided. A man living in Virginia, might support the Union, while his own brother believed the Confederacy was right. Friends who had grown up together suddenly found themselves preparing to fight on opposite sides. The Civil War would eventually produce thousands of stories like these. Stories where the enemy wasn't a stranger from another country. It was someone you had known your entire life. When Abraham Lincoln finally took office on March 4th, 1861, the country was already falling apart. He inherited a crisis unlike anything any previous president had ever faced. Several southern states had declared independence. A new government had been created. Armies were beginning to form. And sitting inside Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, was a small military fort that suddenly became the center of the entire conflict. Fort Sumter. Although South Carolina claimed it now belonged to the Confederacy, Union soldiers still occupied the fort. They refused to leave. The problem was that they were running out of food. Lincoln had to decide what to do. If he abandoned the fort, many people would see it as admitting that the Confederacy was a legitimate country. If he sent warships carrying soldiers and weapons, it could start a war. Instead, Lincoln chose a middle path. He announced that he would send ships carrying only food and basic supplies. Nothing more. His reasoning was simple. Surely no one would fire on a supply mission delivering food to hungry soldiers. But Confederate leaders reached a different conclusion. If Fort Sumter continued receiving supplies, it would remain a permanent Union military base inside Confederate territory. They decided they couldn't allow that to happen. Before dawn on April 12, 1861, Confederate cannons opened fire. For more than 30 hours, artillery shells pounded the fort from every direction. Smoke filled the harbor, walls crumbled, fires spread through the buildings. Finally, the Union commander surrendered. Remarkably, almost no one died during the bombardment itself. But the importance of Fort Sumter had nothing to do with casualties. Those cannon shots ended decades of political argument. The Civil War had officially begun. News raced across the country. In northern cities, crowds gathered outside newspaper offices waiting for updates. Church bells rang. Young men rushed to recruiting stations. President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down what he described as a rebellion. That decision triggered another wave of secession. Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee now joined the Confederacy, bringing the total to 11 states. The conflict had suddenly become far larger than anyone imagined only a few weeks earlier. Yet despite the growing tension, optimism remained surprisingly high. Many politicians believed the war would be over within a few months. Newspapers predicted one decisive battle. Young soldiers told their families they would be home before Christmas. Some packed only enough clothes for a short campaign. They couldn't have known they were stepping into one of the deadliest wars in modern history. Only 3 months after Fort Sumter, the two armies finally met near a small stream in Virginia called Bull Run. Both governments expected a quick victory. Instead, the battle shattered every illusion Americans still had about the war. By the end of the day, thousands of soldiers lay dead, wounded, or missing, and one thing had become painfully clear. This wasn't going to be a short war. It was going to become a fight for the future of the United States itself. The First Battle of Bull Run, fought in July 1861, was supposed to prove which side would win the war. Instead, it proved that neither side had any idea what they were getting into. Thousands of civilians from nearby Washington actually traveled to watch the battle, bringing picnic baskets and binoculars as if they were attending a public event. Many expected to see the Union Army defeat the Confederates in a single afternoon before everyone returned home victorious. The reality was chaos. The battle shifted back and forth for hours as inexperienced soldiers struggled to follow orders in thick clouds of smoke. Officers lost track of entire units, reinforcements arrived unexpectedly, and confusion spread across the battlefield. Then Confederate troops, led in part by General Thomas Jackson, refused to give ground despite repeated Union attacks. Watching Jackson's men stand firm, one Confederate officer reportedly shouted that they were standing like a stone wall. The nickname stayed with him forever. From that day on, Thomas Jackson became known as Stonewall Jackson. As fresh Confederate soldiers entered the fight, Union lines finally collapsed. What began as an organized retreat quickly turned into panic. Soldiers abandoned rifles, wagons, and equipment as they rushed back toward Washington, crashing into the same civilians who had come expecting a comfortable afternoon watching history unfold. By sunset, the illusion of a quick war had disappeared. The North realized defeating the Confederacy would be far more difficult than expected. The South celebrated its victory, believing it had proven its independence could be defended. In reality, both sides had only taken their first step into 4 years of unimaginable bloodshed. Over the next several months, the war expanded rapidly. Volunteer armies became professional armies. Small military camps grew into enormous training centers. Factories worked around the clock producing rifles, cannons, uniforms, and ammunition. Railroads carried thousands of soldiers across vast distances, while telegraph lines allowed commanders to communicate faster than ever before. The Union held important advantages. It had nearly twice the population of the Confederacy, far more factories, a much larger railroad network, and greater industrial production. Almost everything needed to fight a modern war, guns, ammunition, locomotives, iron, machinery, and ships, could be produced in much greater numbers by the North. The Confederacy understood this perfectly. It knew it probably couldn't win a long war based on resources alone. Instead, its strategy focused on endurance. If Southern armies could continue winning enough battles, perhaps Northern voters would eventually grow tired of the cost and demand peace. The Confederacy didn't necessarily need to conquer the North. It simply needed to survive long enough for the Union to give up. For much of the early war, that strategy seemed surprisingly successful. The Confederacy produced several outstanding military commanders, none more respected than General Robert E. Lee. Originally, Lee had been offered command of the Union Army before the war began. He opposed secession personally, but when his home state of Virginia joined the Confederacy, he made a decision that would define his life. He chose to fight for Virginia. Lee quickly earned a reputation as one of the finest battlefield commanders of his generation. Time after time, he defeated larger Union armies through aggressive tactics and bold decision-making. His victories frustrated President Lincoln, who constantly searched for Union generals willing to pursue Confederate forces after battles instead of allowing them to escape. But while armies clashed across the South, another issue was becoming impossible to ignore. What role should slavery play in the war? When the conflict began, Lincoln insisted his main goal was preserving the Union. He knew that several slaveholding border states had remained loyal to the United States, and he feared that declaring an immediate war against slavery might push them into joining the Confederacy. So, for the first year of the war, Lincoln moved cautiously. But events on the battlefield began changing everything. As Union armies advanced into Confederate territory, thousands of enslaved people escaped plantations and sought protection behind Union lines. Some walked for days with little food or water, risking capture every mile of the journey. Others crossed rivers under cover of darkness or hid in forests until Union soldiers arrived nearby. Many Union officers faced a difficult question. Should these men, women, and children be returned to their owners? Increasingly, the answer became no. Instead, many escaped slaves began working for the Union Army, building roads, transporting supplies, cooking, caring for wounded soldiers, and gathering valuable information about Confederate positions. The war was changing, and so was Lincoln. He had come to believe that slavery wasn't simply connected to the conflict, it was helping sustain the Confederacy itself. Every plantation producing crops through enslaved labor strengthened the Southern war effort. Ending slavery, therefore, could also weaken the Confederate military. Still, Lincoln waited. He wanted to announce such an important decision after a military success rather than during a period of defeat. That opportunity finally arrived in September 1862. Robert E. Lee decided to invade the North. His hope was ambitious. A major Confederate victory on Union soil might convince Britain or France to officially recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation. Foreign recognition could bring financial support, military supplies, and perhaps even change the entire course of the war. The Union Army moved quickly to stop him. The two forces met near Antietam Creek in Maryland. What followed became the bloodiest single day in American history. Before sunrise, soldiers marched into battle through heavy morning fog. By the end of the day, Fields, roads, and farmland had been transformed into scenes of unimaginable destruction. More than 22,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or reported missing in a single day of fighting. Although the battle ended without a decisive winner, Lee's invasion had been stopped. That was enough for Lincoln. On September 22, 1862, he announced that beginning the following January, all enslaved people living in territories still controlled by the Confederacy would be declared free. The Emancipation Proclamation transformed the Civil War forever. The Union was no longer fighting only to preserve the country. It was now fighting to destroy slavery as well. The announcement also changed how the rest of the world viewed the conflict. European governments could no longer easily support the Confederacy without appearing to support slavery itself, making foreign recognition far less likely. Perhaps the proclamation's greatest impact came from those whose lives it directly affected. Thousands of African American men volunteered to serve in the Union Army. Many had escaped slavery themselves. Others had been born free. Together, nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors would eventually fight for the Union, proving their courage on battlefields across the country while helping reshape the future of the United States. By the start of 1863, both sides understood something that had once seemed impossible. The Civil War wasn't getting smaller. It was becoming even more dangerous. And before the year ended, two battles fought just one day apart would completely change the course of the war. By the summer of 1863, both sides knew the war had entered a new phase. The excitement that had filled recruiting stations 2 years earlier was gone. Nearly every town had buried fathers, brothers, sons, or friends. Hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers, and both governments were spending enormous amounts of money just to keep their armies in the field. Yet neither side was ready to quit. For the Confederacy, the situation was becoming increasingly difficult. Food was growing scarce, supplies were harder to replace. Every experienced soldier lost in battle was almost impossible to replace with someone equally trained. General Robert E. Lee understood this, but he also believed waiting would only make things worse. If the Confederacy remained on the defensive, the Union's superior population and industry would eventually overwhelm it. So Lee made one final gamble. Instead of waiting for the Union to invade again, he marched his army into Pennsylvania. His plan was simple: win a decisive victory on northern soil. If he could defeat the Union Army there, he hoped ordinary people in the North would begin demanding peace instead of more war. A major Confederate victory might even persuade Britain or France to recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation. It was an enormous risk, but Lee believed it offered his best chance to change the course of the war. In early July 1863, the two armies unexpectedly met near the small town of Gettysburg. What began as a minor clash quickly grew into one of the largest battles ever fought in North America. Over 3 days, more than 160,000 soldiers fought across hills, farms, and open fields surrounding the town. The first day ended with Confederate forces pushing the Union Army back. But instead of retreating completely, Union soldiers established strong defensive positions on the high ground south of Gettysburg. That decision would prove critical. The second day brought relentless fighting. Confederate attacks struck both ends of the Union line, hoping to break through before reinforcements arrived. Some of the fiercest fighting occurred on rocky hillsides where soldiers battled at incredibly close range, often for control of ground measuring only a few hundred yards. Neither side gained the decisive advantage it desperately needed. Then came the third day. General Lee believed the center of the Union line had been weakened. He ordered nearly 12,000 Confederate soldiers to march across an open field toward heavily defended Union positions. It became known as Pickett's Charge. The attack began with a massive artillery bombardment, but when the Confederate infantry finally advanced, they faced concentrated rifle and cannon fire almost the entire way. The soldiers continued moving forward despite terrible losses. Some reached the Union lines. Most never did. Within less than an hour, the assault had collapsed. Thousands of Confederate soldiers lay dead or wounded across the fields of Gettysburg. Lee's invasion of the North was over. It was one of the greatest turning points of the entire Civil War. Almost at the exact same time, another decisive battle was ending hundreds of miles away. While Gettysburg captured headlines in the east, Union General Ulysses S. Grant had surrounded the Confederate city of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. The city was incredibly important. Whoever controlled Vicksburg controlled the Mississippi, the most important river in North America. It served as the main transportation route through the center of the country, carrying soldiers, supplies, and trade. Grant understood that capturing the city would split the Confederacy in half. Instead of launching costly attacks, he surrounded Vicksburg and waited. Weeks passed. Food inside the city slowly disappeared. Families dug caves into hillsides to escape constant artillery fire. Soldiers survived on tiny rations while civilians struggled simply to stay alive. Finally, on July 4, 1863, one day after the fighting at Gettysburg ended, Vicksburg surrendered. The Union now controlled the entire Mississippi River. Within 48 hours, the Confederacy had suffered two devastating defeats. Gettysburg ended Lee's last major invasion of the North. Vicksburg divided the Confederacy into two separate halves, making it far more difficult to move men and supplies across the South. Neither battle ended the war, but together they shifted its momentum permanently. President Lincoln now needed someone capable of turning that momentum into victory. He found that man in Ulysses S. Grant. Unlike several previous Union commanders, Grant refused to celebrate victories and then stop fighting. His philosophy was simple: keep moving, keep attacking. Never allow the Confederate Army time to recover. When Lincoln promoted Grant to command all Union armies in 1864, many people questioned the decision. Grant had earned a reputation for taking heavy casualties during his campaigns. Newspapers accused him of being reckless with the lives of his soldiers. Lincoln saw something different. He saw a general who never gave up. When one battle ended, Grant immediately prepared for the next. When Confederate forces retreated, Grant followed them instead of allowing them to escape. His strategy placed constant pressure on Robert E. Lee's army. The fighting became brutal. Battles like the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor produced enormous casualties on both sides. Thousands of men were killed or wounded in fighting that often lasted only a few hours. Criticism of Grant grew louder. Many people wondered whether the cost was becoming too great. Grant understood the painful reality of the war. The Union could replace its losses. The Confederacy could not. Every battle weakened Lee's army a little more. Every month reduced the South's ability to continue fighting. Grant wasn't trying to win a single spectacular battle. He was slowly exhausting the Confederate army. While Grant kept Lee pinned down in Virginia, another Union general prepared a campaign that would strike directly at the Confederacy's ability to wage war. His name was William Tecumseh Sherman, and the strategy he was about to use would become one of the most controversial military campaigns in American history. By 1864, it was becoming clear that the Confederacy could no longer win the war through battlefield victories alone. Its armies were shrinking, its railroads were falling apart, food shortages were becoming common, and every month that passed made replacing soldiers, horses, weapons, and supplies even more difficult. The Union, meanwhile, continued growing stronger. While General Grant kept Robert E. Lee's army locked in constant fighting around Virginia, General William Tecumseh Sherman launched a campaign that would strike at the heart of the Confederacy. His first objective was Atlanta. At the time, Atlanta was one of the South's most important railroad centers. Supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements all passed through the city. If it fell, the Confederate war effort would suffer a devastating blow. After months of hard fighting, Union forces finally captured Atlanta in September 1864. The victory was enormous. In the North, it renewed hope that the war could finally be won. Just as importantly, it helped Abraham Lincoln secure re-election later that year. Had Lincoln lost the election, the new president might have chosen to negotiate peace rather than continue the war. With Atlanta under Union control, Sherman made an even bolder decision. Instead of chasing Confederate armies, he would march across Georgia toward the Atlantic Ocean, destroying anything that could support the South's ability to keep fighting. Railroads were torn apart, bridges were burned, military warehouses were emptied, factories were destroyed. The campaign became known as Sherman's March to the Sea. For Southern civilians, it was devastating. Many watched as years of work disappeared in a matter of hours. Although Sherman generally tried to avoid unnecessary violence against civilians themselves, his army deliberately targeted the infrastructure that kept the Confederacy alive. His message was clear. The South could no longer continue this war. By the beginning of 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Richmond, the Confederate capital, was running out of food. Inflation had become so severe that Confederate money was nearly worthless. Desertions increased as exhausted soldiers returned home to help families struggling simply to survive. General Lee knew the situation was hopeless, but he continued fighting because he believed it was his duty. In early April, Union forces finally broke through the Confederate defenses around Richmond. The Confederate government abandoned the city, and Lee began retreating west, hoping to join other Southern armies and continue the fight. Grant refused to let him escape. Union troops stayed close behind, cutting off roads and capturing desperately needed supplies before Lee's men could reach them. The Confederate army grew weaker with every passing day. Many soldiers had gone days without proper food. Others marched barefoot because their boots had completely worn out. The army that had once terrified Union commanders was now exhausted, hungry, and surrounded. On April 9, 1865, near the small village of Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, Robert E. Lee accepted the reality that could no longer be avoided. He requested a meeting with Ulysses S. Grant. The two generals met inside a modest brick house that still stands today. Grant offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers would surrender their weapons and promise not to fight again. In return, they would be allowed to return home. Many officers were even permitted to keep their horses so they could plant crops and rebuild their farms. Grant understood that the war had to end without creating unnecessary bitterness. The goal now was not revenge. It was rebuilding the nation. As news of Lee's surrender spread across the country, celebrations erupted throughout the North. People filled the streets. Church bells rang. For the first time in 4 years, Americans could finally imagine peace. But only 5 days later, that celebration turned into heartbreak. On the evening of April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. During the performance, actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth entered the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. The next morning, Abraham Lincoln died. The nation had won the war. Its president would never see the peace. Lincoln's assassination shocked the entire country. Millions mourned the man who had guided the Union through its darkest crisis. His funeral train traveled through several states, allowing countless Americans to pay their final respects. Although Lee's surrender effectively ended the war, a few remaining Confederate forces surrendered over the following weeks, bringing the conflict to a complete close. The United States had survived, but it had paid an unimaginable price. More than 600,000 soldiers had died, though modern historians believe the true number may have been even higher. Entire towns had lost a generation of young men. Thousands of families would spend years rebuilding homes, farms, businesses, and their lives. Perhaps the war's most lasting achievement was the end of slavery. Later in 1865, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution officially abolished slavery throughout the United States, permanently ending an institution that had existed since the country's earliest days. But ending slavery did not end the struggle for equality. The years that followed, known as Reconstruction, brought new political battles over civil rights, voting, and the future of the South. Many of those challenges would continue for generations. Even today, the Civil War remains one of the most studied events in American history because its impact reaches far beyond the battlefield. It preserved the United States as a single nation. It ended slavery. It transformed the federal government, and it forever changed the lives of millions of Americans. The story of the Civil War is ultimately a reminder of what can happen when political divisions grow so deep that compromise becomes impossible. It shows how decades of unresolved conflict can eventually erupt into violence, and how rebuilding a nation can be just as difficult as saving one. More than 160 years later, its battlefields remain preserved, its leaders are still debated, and its lessons continue to shape conversations about freedom, unity, and democracy. Because the American Civil War wasn't just a fight over territory or politics, It was a struggle over what kind of nation the United States would become. And in many ways, that conversation continues even today.